Okay, so now that we understand what it is that we need to do, let's actually start building this payment route on our Express server. So in Express, it's actually very easy in order to build the actual route. The way that we do it is we use the app object that we have from Express, and what we say is we declare the type of route that we want it to be. So for us, we know what we want to make is a post route, because what we want the app to do is receive an actual request from our client-side code to some route that we're going to call /payment. So /payment is the name of the route that we want to hit. And then what we're going to do is we are going to pass this post method a function. And this function is going to get both a request object and a response object. And what we're going to do with the actual request object is the request object will provide us the actual token that we need in order to make the charge. Now, as you remember, this token is something we get back from our Stripe button on our front end. Using the Stripe checkout, whenever the user completes that checkout process using that modal, they're going to get back a token that has an ID on it that represents all of the information that they just filled out, as well as the actual credit card information and the cost and everything on it that we need in order to properly make a charge to Stripe. That token is the identifier that allows Stripe to know who is making that request and where it's coming from. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to have to actually create the appropriate body object that we pass to Stripe using values that we get from the token. And that token, of course, as we know, is going to come in through the request that we make from our front end. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Let's just first set up our backend. So what we need to do for this body object is we need to pass it a source parameter. This, of course, is all the things that we need from Stripe. So if you're curious about what other things we can pass to Stripe, I will link the documentation about the actual Stripe library that we're using. But it's actually pretty simple in order to make this charge. The source is going to be the request.body, because the request object has a body parameter, and on that body is where it will hold all of the information that we're passing inside of our request to our backend. So request.body.token.id. So on that token object will be an ID value that we need to pass. After that, we also need the amount. So the amount value is going to be the total charge cost that we're trying to make. And that we're also going to pass to the body. And we're just going to call it amount when we actually generate the request on our front end. Finally, we need the currency. And let's just default this to USD. You can use other currency strings that you can find on the Stripe backend API that they're willing to accept. But for our case, USD is good enough for us. And with this body object, we're now going to need to use it and pass it to our Stripe library. Now, what we need to do is bring in our Stripe library into this file. And we want to do this after line 6, because in order to actually leverage this Stripe library that we're trying to bring in, we need access to that secret key that we stored in our .env file. Now, you remember in our last lesson, I asked you to add that Stripe secret key value that you got back from your Stripe dashboard and put it in the .env, because then we'll have access to it inside of process environment, which allows us to actually hide that key from anybody that might look at it inside of our code base. So what we'll do is we'll actually say const stripe equals require stripe. Now, what this gives us back is a function, and the function expects a argument as the first parameter, where that argument is the Stripe secret key. So we can actually pass that right into what we get back from our require, like so. We're essentially saying, give me what that Stripe library wants to give you, and then I want to immediately invoke it with that Stripe secret key, which we now have access to on our process.environment.stripe secret key. And the reason we have this is because of this line. Because we required .env and then we called config, this automatically looks for a .env file type inside of the root folder, and it will add it to our process environment. So by doing so, we now have access to any variables that we declared inside of that .env file, giving us access to our Stripe secret key. And now from this function that we got back from Stripe after we pass it this value, it will give us back the Stripe object that we can finally use to actually make charges. Now, in order to make the charge, we go back to our route that we were writing, and we say stripe.charges.create. And what we pass to the create call is 2 arguments. The first is the body that we just made, this body object. And then what we're going to do is we are going to pass it a callback in the same format that we have here, because that callback is going to represent the request and the response object that we get back from this Stripe API request that we're making to make a charge. Now, the thing is that what we want to do is we want to inform our client-side application how successful the actual request they're making is. Now, if you look at this function that we defined right here, that we're essentially writing as the second argument to app.post, we got a request object and we have a response object. The request object is the object that holds all of the details and information and data related to the request being made from the front end. So as we know, this had the body of the token and anything we were sending from our client-side application to our backend. Now, what we do with the response object is actually how we respond to this request. So this is how we send back stuff based on whatever request that we got. So what we're essentially trying to say is that inside of this payment route, we have access to the request that we got from the client-side app, but also access to this response object that we need to use in order to send information back to the client-side app. The only thing is that we want to send this response after we've made a payment charge to the Stripe service, because this payment we're attempting to make could succeed or fail due to the fact that it's an API call as well. So it's subject to the same success or failure calls that we've seen and become familiar with whenever we make an API call of any kind. So what this second argument in create is getting is actually a function where the Stripe service hands us back both an error, if there is one, or a response if it's successful. And what we want to do is use the response object that we are getting from the request made from the client-side application to this backend route to tell our actual client-side application whether or not we got an error or whether or not we were successful. So what we'll write is if Stripe error, then what we want to do is say response.status was 500, because 500 is a failure status code. And then we want to send with the error being the actual Stripe error. If there is no error, then what we want to do is say that it's a status of 200. And if the status is 200, then we want to say that it's successful, and what we want to pass to it is the Stripe response. And that's all it is. We're essentially just setting up this one route that when any request gets made to the payment route, we're going to use the token and we're going to use the amount and we're going to make a Stripe charge. And then depending on whether or not we get back an error, we're going to then send our client side that made the request the fact that we got an error. But if it's successful, we're going to inform it that we got successful using the Stripe response. And this is our route. So I know it was a lot of new backend code, but this is really it. Conceptually, that's really all it is. You just have to figure out how to use this library that you got alongside with how the code and the requests that are being made actually look based on the format that we're using when we write this node code. So hopefully this code made sense, because this is all we're doing. This one route is the whole point of why we're setting up this backend server, because Stripe requires us to hide our Stripe secret key, which we did with our .env library, as well as hiding it inside of our process environment. And then using this object, we're able to make the charge. So now that we have our back end, let's actually figure out how to write our front end button code so that we can actually send our token to this new route that we made. And we're going to do that in the next lesson.